Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. If you are enjoying our videos, you can help us out by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. Today, I'll be speaking with Sohrab Ahmari. He is the op-ed editor of the New York Post and author of The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. Sohrab Ahmari, welcome to NatConTalk.
Thank you, Yoram. It's good to be with you.
It's really wonderful to have you on, and I'm very excited about your new book, The Unbroken Thread, which makes the case for a return to tradition both at the political level and also at the personal level. Now, you yourself have been a great example of just that in American public life. You've turned to Catholicism in the last few years, and along with that, I'd say a political transition maybe towards a higher octane conservatism. I want to begin by asking you about these transitions in your own life. At the beginning of the book, you write the following. Once I immigrated to the United States, I reveled in the chance to remake myself anew each day. My moral opinions were as interchangeable as my clothing styles and musical tastes. I could pick up and drop this ideology or that. I could be a high school goth, a college socialist, a law school neoconservative. I could dabble in drugs and build an identity around my dabbling. I could get a girlfriend, cheat on her, dump her, and build a pseudo-identity around that too. But lately, my mind has taken an unexpected turn. I've come to believe that the very modes of life and thinking that strike most people in the West as an antiquated or limiting can liberate us, while the Western dream of autonomy and choice without limits is in fact a prison. Why don't you tell us a little bit more? You began like so many other people. How did you come to embrace the Catholic Church?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for asking that question, Yoram. I am often accused of being a frequent convert, and as you read that passage, I feel like having done that myself. It's true. But in a deeper way, I see a kind of interior integrity and wholeness to what may, to a kind of superficial outsider, look like a series of sudden jumps between worldviews. And so to stage it briefly, there's kind of a pair of parallel political and theological transformations. The theological one, I've retold in my memoir, From Fire by Water, of why I came to believe in, first of all, a God, a personal God, a God of the Bible, and then ultimately the God of the Bible as I found him in kind of the fullness of the Catholic Church. So that's a different story, although it's not unrelated to this other transformation, which is a political one. And that has to do with the fact that obviously I rejected, while I was in Iran, I rejected the official ideology of the Ayatollah's Islamic Republic, the Shiite Islamism that had dealt some pretty brutal blows to my own family, and obviously that's why we immigrated. And I come to the West, and in the West, I find, to my own surprise, in some ways, because I was rebellious in Iran, and I then wanted to be rebellious in the West as well. But the more I reflected on the society that I had inherited, the more I saw a decent society that has some unique things about how it treats the human person, how it honors the dignity of the human person, the orderliness of its laws, and so forth. And I wanted to, essentially, as an immigrant who has a great deal of gratitude, I wanted to preserve precisely those things, those elements of Western society that had attracted families like mine and millions of others to come to the United States. And as in my early 20s, having just joined the Wall Street Journal opinion pages at the time, I saw the main threat to that way of life as being encapsulated in Islamism, jihadism, regimes like the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, by the way, those forces are still anti-Western forces. They're serious threats. But as time went on, and I'm kind of experiencing life as an adult Westerner, again, reading more, reflecting more, becoming a parent, becoming a person of faith, it occurred to me that the real threats to what's best about the West, what is most decent about the West, come from the inside and come from ideological disorders on the inside, to which my neoconservative former colleagues, ex-friends, some of them still friends despite our political disagreements, either they pay too little attention or they try to kind of externalize everything. And their solution to what ailed the world was to attempt by military force to impose liberal democracy on other nations, which obviously 20 years later, it's been a disastrous outcome, and I had to admit that to myself. And so I began to think, how do we shore up really what's best about the West? And that meant paying attention to theological questions. That meant paying attention to deeper historical and political questions than neoconservatism even took interest in. And so that's been my long trajectory. And again, I see an inner integrity to it all. You know, as I put it recently to a reporter who asked me about this, that you've changed your mind, I said, yeah, I've taken a winding path to what I think is the truth in following my own conscience and responding to world events. But woe unto some of the neoconservatives who cling to their mistaken ideas in the face of all evidence to this day about the mistakes that they made.
Well, to me, look, to me, it looks like it has an inner coherence, because it seems like all of the, I mean, I don't know you that well, but it seems like the transitions have been in a single direction, and that, you know, away from unbounded freedom, as you write in the book, away from unbounded freedom and towards a search for the traditional constraints that used to animate Western countries, and including the United States. Can you tell us just a little bit about, from the inside, what does that feel like?
From the inside, what it felt like was a confused young man in his, you know, mid-20s to mid to late 20s, and then edging into my 30s, in the sense that I'm career-wise going from strength to strength. I'm working as an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal in London, but something is missing. I have a conscience that tells me, that points me to the existence of God. There's this interior voice that says that enjoins me to do good and to avoid evil. And I can't quite explain it in materialist terms. In other words, I can accept what modern scientists might tell us, that the voice of the conscience is the reflection of thousands of years of evolutionary behavior, blah, 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 or that it's just synapses firing in my brains. I could accept those as a matter of answers to the how questions, but they didn't suffice to answer the why questions. And then I begin, after having been a militant atheist, I finally sit down and I read the Hebrew Bible and I read the Torah, and I find in the Torah a kind of an account of that voice externalized and explained in the God of the Hebrew Bible, who says to Cain, "What have you done? What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Well, that's a voice that I interiorly heard, right? Whenever I screwed up in life, or when I did well, and it reassured me that there was either way, that there was an objective morality and an objective moral order. How do you explain that? Well, ultimately, I had to conclude that objective order reflects a supreme being who governs the world, so that's how I came to believe in God. I had a couple of providential encounters with the Mass. Those I couldn't explain, in the sense that at various stages in my life were moments of anguish, moments of existential crisis, where I found myself in Catholic churches. And I found both the kind of the aspect of grace, of forgiveness, of divine love in the Mass, but also authority, as encapsulated by you go to any Catholic church, and there's a picture of the reigning pontiff in the vestibule of the church. And so I sought both those things. I sought both the grace, but also the kind of absolute authority of the Catholic Church as a moral voice on earth. And so I ultimately decided, I was living in London at the time, and I went to a Catholic church and I knocked on the priest's door and I said, I wish to become a Roman Catholic. And he just sort of said, very well, I shall instruct you. He didn't miss a beat.
Oh, I'm glad it's so welcoming. That's good. You know, we Jews, we kind of have this tradition of making people knock a few more times.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go to the other side of your very articulate public persona, now the political one. And I think if I remember correctly, I think the first time that I felt that you were you're taking not just a public religious position, but also kind of a nationalist approach to your politics. I think it was in March 2019 with the manifesto about the dead consensus that appeared in First Things. And so tell us what happened there, because I mean I'm also friends with John Podhoretz and Bret Stephens, the people that you mention as your mentors, neoconservatives who I've had super warm relationships with them for many years, but our politics are very, very far apart at this point. So how did this happen and why?
We can get into the question of nationalism, because the Against the Dead Consensus manifesto, of which I was the principal drafter, but I was joined by several friends, mainly Catholics, Rod Dreher, although he's not Catholic, he's the one exception, Patrick Deneen, a lot of familiar names in that space. What we said was we support the new nationalism insofar as it's a bulwark against a repressive liberal universalism that would impose universalism essentially either at the force of arms or sanctions or what have you on all nations. So it was a kind of narrow embrace of nationalism, but you're right that as between, let's say, the new nationalists like yourself and our liberal internationalist neoconservative friends, I'm on any given kind of discrete issue, I'm with you almost always. And how that came about is, I think a lot of young religious intellectuals feel that that it's very important to actually look around us and see that what ails the West today is precisely a kind of excess of rights talk, of liberal rights talk, and of liberal dogmatism, which, in using the language of liberty, the honorable term liberty, has done away with lots of limits that actually make you live a more humane, a more truly free life. So it's easier for me to talk about concrete examples, and maybe our viewers will make sense of this. So, for example, the ideology of liberty that our classical liberals and neoconservative friends have adopted is so absolutist that in practice it means empowering Silicon Valley oligarchs who are acting in a very sinisterly censorious way to repress freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And it's a kind of paradox where the empowerment of private actors has created a kind of private tyranny which is destroying public rights. Now, I experienced that in a very vivid way in October as an editor at the New York Post, where we did a story on Hunter Biden, perfectly legitimate story. We can go into the facts, but basically, questioning, suggesting that maybe Joe Biden was involved in graft, helping enrich his sons, using his position as the second most powerful man in the world at the time as vice president of the United States. Still undisputed, The emails that we at the Post uncovered are still, not Joe Biden, not Hunter Biden has disputed the authenticity of the emails. And yet, Twitter suspended our account. Facebook reduced circulation on our story. Now, this is the New York Post. It was founded by Alexander Hamilton. It's the oldest daily newspaper in the United States. You see how the rise of a kind of private oligarchy has paradoxically turned our free speech rights, which are very sacred as Americans, into paper rights, mere paper rights. Because I can go out there, I live in Manhattan, I go out to the middle of Midtown Manhattan, bang a drum and say, Hunter Biden might be corrupt. No one will listen to me and I'll look like a nutter. So if these rights mean anything, they have to play out on the internet. And on the internet, we don't have any defense against this kind of private tyranny. The ideology of open borders has paradoxically caused a kind of social incohesion that creates excessive mistrust in a lot of Western societies. I saw that firsthand in Europe. I got a kind of multicultural anxiety living in London, and I'm Iranian born. And on and on. You can give numerous examples of this. The ideology of the assertion of my identity as a gendered being, which is in tension with the body that I inherited from nature, this kind of transgender ideology, has paradoxically destroyed women's sports and other kind of public arenas in which women had made gains. So in each of these cases, and this is the point of the manifesto you referred to, the removal of various barriers has paradoxically made us less free. And now with the demolition, it's only with the demolition of those barriers that we recognize that actually they kept us free. They kept our societies humane. And so this is a kind of idea that I constantly come back to in the book and in my other writing as well, where limits make us free and the absence of limits paradoxically imprison us.
So let's talk a little bit about the book. The book is called The Unbroken Thread, and you do come back time and again to this image of a thread that you can pull on, and it actually leads you to be able to, when you follow it, leads you to be able to see, as you write, the entire fabric, the fabric of what it was that created the West and made it something great and worthwhile. Now, what's interesting, I mean, there's many interesting things about the book. One very interesting thing is the strategy that you pick. This, although there's a good deal of Christianity in the book, but the book is in fact ecumenical. There's a chapter about Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Jewish Sabbath. There's a very moving chapter about Confucian traditions, which you're familiar with through your own family, and it comes across as being a very, very non-dogmatic kind of an approach to the thread. There's even a chapter on Andrea Dworkin, who's a prominent feminist from became famous in the 1960s for her crusading against pornography, especially, and so I very much enjoyed this feeling that you yourself are a serious Catholic, and it comes across very much in often in in your public persona and debates. Here you kind of give us a different side to your personality. I don't mean that it contradicts, but I think it might be surprising to some people that the unbroken thread you're talking about is not it's not just the thread of the Catholic Church. It is a kind of a number of different threads that come together in order to let's say to provide different paths for different people to come to these crucial pieces of tradition that you're talking about. How do you see that?
Yeah, so as a Catholic, for me there is tradition with a capital T, which is a very specific source of authority in the Catholic Church, alongside scripture, alongside the papal magisterium. And then there's a kind of tradition, the patristic tradition of what's been handed down. And it's co-equal with the others. And that comes across in the book. But I also think there is such a thing as traditions with small c, traditions with small t, which as a Catholic, for me, they don't threaten my adherence to the capital T tradition, because obviously I believe that there are lots of things that human beings can access by natural reason. And so, or in some cases, there's a chapter on natural revelation, which is a complicated concept, but that there's lots that human beings have accumulated across societies, across generations, which is true and which is not in tension with the kind of, to my mind, divinely inspired traditions of the Catholic Church, but that are rather complementary. Now, the figures that you mentioned don't all agree with each other, obviously. So, for example, I have a chapter on St. Augustine on faith and politics, and then I have a chapter on Seneca about how to think about death. Seneca was far too comfortable with suicide for St. Augustine's comfort, right? They would not agree on that. Andrea Dworkin would not want to be placed next to any of these other figures. Hans Jonas, the kind of great Jewish modern scholar of Gnosticism, wasn't quite a believer in the traditional sense, whereas obviously lots of the other figures are. So, but I'm willing to kind of let those figures sit next to each other, acknowledging where their intention, or being willing to admit when their intention, but nevertheless noticing that all of these traditions, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Confucian even, all of them come back to that same insight, of that same wisdom, which is in the subtitle, which is the wisdom of limits. So, for example, Hans Jonas, critic of Gnosticism, urges us to accept the body as this essential limit, that the human body as we receive it from nature has meaning, has a norm, has its own norms. You could call that natural law, and therefore to seek to transcend the body, whether that's through transgenderism, transhumanism, all sorts of movements that seek to treat the human being as a purely spiritual mind apparatus that happens to be stuck to this fleshly body. Also, all of those movements dehumanize us somewhat and threaten human dignity in its fullest sense. Seneca teaches us that accepting natural death as a limit is worthwhile, and people who try to overcome death, whether by technological means or what have you, actually end up living miserable lives. And the human lifespan only gains its meaning in relation to an endpoint like death. Abraham Joshua Heschel teaches us that setting aside one day for God, for family, and not for this kind of acquisitiveness and clamor and competition that defines the rest of our lives, makes us freer, actually. So what looks like a restriction, again, paradoxically ends up being liberating, whereas the loss of the Sabbath makes us live kind of harried, stressful, miserable lives. So again, although they disagree with each other, I think what I'm trying to get at is they all point to us to the importance of limits on liberty as a source of liberation.
I was very grateful that that Heschel gets to get such a prominent place to speak to the world about the Sabbath. You know, it is something that is, you know, I think for Jews it's kind of strange to encounter devout Christians, and I myself, you know, I speak in front of lots of Christian groups from all sorts of denominations in different parts of the world, and this subject often does come up because the Sabbath, it is one of the 10 Commandments, It's true that the Christians had a different Sabbath for most of their history, or most Christians did, and that's something that we could discuss. But the move to simply not have a Sabbath at all, which I think is pretty much where most of society is, including many Christians that I talk about, and I ask them, why don't you keep the Sabbath? And I think it's a very uncomfortable, not because they think I shouldn't be asking, but actually most of the time because they feel that they should be keeping the Sabbath in some significant way. Now, you just published an essay in the Wall Street Journal, I guess an excerpt, on the Sabbath yourself. So what is your message? What is your message of the Sabbath? How do you see this, having read Heschel and presented him in the book as part of your bouquet of great Western thinkers, but now you're saying something very particular to people living in our society, that the absence of the Sabbath is actually quite destructive.
Yes, I mean we talk briefly about how Heschel thought about it. I think it's a beautiful metaphor, I guess you could call it, or a beautiful image, where he says that most of our life is spent in the realm of space, in conquering geopolitical territory, in prospering economically. But there is this other realm, which he called the realm of time, which is the realm of the Sabbath. And in the realm of time, or the palace of time even, which is just this wonderful Heschel image of the Sabbath as a palace of time, you are called to detach yourself from the things of space, from your competition with your fellow human beings, from your desire to dominate nature, and just to be. And why is it the realm of time? It's because it connects us with the eternal. Everything else, all those things that you attach yourself to, and race, and I race as much as anyone. Believe me, I'm a kind of a man of action. I'm not a contemplative, but but all of those things will pass. Every single one of them is contingent. The only thing that's not is Almighty God. And so to hallow one day in the image of God's own celebration of creation in Genesis, and that hallow one day just to be, not to compete, not to acquire, not to fight with people on the internet, is incredibly relaxing. Now, you're right that my Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish friends, their Sabbath is still, frankly, a lot more of a Sabbath in terms of how offline they go and how really they sort of disconnect compared to the rest of us. But even, for a modern American family, even a half a day of rest would be really useful. And I think the fact that a lot of families don't get it, and especially when you go to working class people, they're at the mercy of a lot of large firms now use what's called algorithmic human resources scheduling. So that just means that the company will schedule their time just to minimize labor costs and just to maximize efficiency, without regard to, okay, well, someone needs to spend time with the kids in the morning and go to go to church or just to be with family. That's not there. And I think it's one of the causes of the fact that we see such low rates of family formation, such low rates of marriage and childbearing, and then you have these kind of dissolute, chaotic lives. It's just it doesn't have that rhythm of work, but one day we rest, one day we spend with each other. So I guess I would argue for restoring Sabbath blue laws. Now, I know a lot of my Jewish friends will say, but that actually made life harder for Jews who are observant, because obviously that means that they've lost 2 days over the weekend. But if you think about it, this country had Sabbatarianism. I mean, the United States before it was a nation. Before, in colonial Virginia, they had Sabbath blue laws, and Virginia was supposed to be less religious than New England. In New Amsterdam, the Dutch imposed Sabbath blue laws. And up until not too long ago, it was just the norm. I mean, it was only in 2019, I think, that North Dakota became the last state to get rid of its statewide blue laws. But with some of our libertarian friends, when you mention all this, if you say, maybe we should have a kind of day of rest, that say, that's authoritarian. And this is a theme that you and I think, would agree on, Yoram, all the time, where the past in a kind of liberal frame, the past of even 2 years ago becomes authoritarian because there was some aspect of life that was not fully left up to individual autonomy and individual choice. And so you begin to look at not just, let alone 200 years ago, even the 1990s become an age of horrible, repressive oppression, what have you. And so these arguments we need to have, because are these people suggesting that our grandfathers were living in a totalitarian state because they couldn't shop for half a day? It's nonsense.
I definitely agree with you that the benefits of the benefits of something like the Sabbath. We'll get to some more examples in a couple of minutes, but the benefit of something like the Sabbath, which is you could say, I mean, it's imposed by tradition. It's not that that Jews or Christians pick their day of rest. It's not that they say, okay, well, this week it's going to be Wednesday. Next week, let's schedule it. It's Thursday. The benefits of it come from the fact that there is an imposition on the entire community, and people are becoming, I think, beginning to become aware of the possible benefits of something like disconnecting from your boss, disconnecting from your rivalries for 24 hours. I think people are beginning to see that. Something that is probably not so visible quite yet is the fact that that those are 24 hours that you spend with your family. And so, of course, they are directed towards God, and they are directed towards learning and tradition. But I'm pretty sure that most people don't get to see their families in this kind of intensive way once a week anymore. And I just every year Thanksgiving comes around, and the American media is filled with people like telling these stories about the family coming together on Thanksgiving. And the weekly Jewish Sabbath is very much like the annual American Thanksgiving. And when you cut off from your boss, it means that you get to spend time with your children. It means that you get to spend time with your neighbors. I know people don't necessarily want to spend time with their neighbors, but there it is. So let's take another example from your book, something that I also think, like the Sabbath, is must be kind of shocking to many of your readers, not just the ones who call themselves liberals, but the ones who call themselves conservatives. You have a very, very moving and important chapter on honoring your father and your mother, which you teach through the Confucian tradition, and the kinds of things that you're talking about. The stories from China are brilliant and lovely, and the book is worth it just for that. But then you turn to talking about the way that you would apply what you call filiality. In Jewish tradition, we say honoring, giving honor to your father and mother, and the kinds of things that you're talking about. You mention deference, meaning that there should be some degree of allowing parents to make decisions or to participate in making decisions. Now, you're not talking about children or teenagers. You're talking about throughout life, and that's of course for us Jews, that is in fact the way that we understand it. It's not this liberal thing of you get to be 18 or 20 and then you're an equal, and so you don't owe your parents honor anymore, but rather you owe it throughout your life. So you mentioned deference, involving them in important decisions. You mention geographic proximity, which is, almost unheard of for Americans. Although I think that in some of the religious communities it's still alive. The idea that how are you going to honor your parents if you're, if they're in New York and you're in California? And then you mentioned, the hardest nut of them all, the not throwing them aside in old age, which again is, you're saying something that makes perfect sense to me, but it looks to me like it's very, very far from the way that Americans live today. This idea that, on the contrary, you're not freed from your obligations when you're 18 or 20. Rather, the opposite. That the older your parents get, the more obligations you have, and those are very brave things to be saying. I think they're very, very important. Do you think there's anybody who wants to hear this?
To be honest, I think that's the chapter it's one of the chapters that will meet with the greatest resistance, once the book, it's still early, but I understand that some prominent left of center outlets are writing about the book. And I think that's the one where it will shock, which is crazy because, again, filiality norms or the commandment to honor your father and your mother is so deeply ingrained in natural law, and then in divine law, and in the Hebrew Bible. But yeah, we live in a world in which parents are people who provide us with material goods until a certain age, and then we say goodbye, and then the obligations become thinner and thinner. I think what I was attracted to, and I'm no Confucian scholar. I happen to be married into a Chinese American family, but that doesn't make you any sort of a scholar in these things. And I'm very open about the fact that I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller, and although I've had academics in each of these areas review each chapter to make sure they're sound, and I believe that a reader encountering each of these will get a good primer about what Confucian filiality was all about, or what Hans Jonas taught about Gnosticism, or what have you. What I was really drawn to as an outsider to this tradition is Confucius's justification for filiality norms, and it's really sophisticated, but also just sort of beautiful. He says, your parents take care of you during the first 3 years of your life, when human beings, by the accident of nature or what have you, were incredibly vulnerable among other kind of animal species. The human child is really vulnerable those 3 years. And so there was a time during which you were utterly dependent on your parents, and your mother breastfed you, your father took you to the doctor when you were sick without you asking for it. They just did these things. And in doing so, they nurtured your moral imagination, so that you learned empathy in a kind of natural way without being taught what it means, but by being held, by being loved. And so you have an obligation to return that in their old age. And in Confucian tradition, there is a very, very much of an emphasis on the idea of filiality being a foundation for a sound political order. The person who honors his or her own parents will also honor the inferiors, people who are his subjects, or people who work for him or her. And he will also honor his superiors, so that filiality kind of flows upward and downward through society, and then kind of ripples out horizontally as well. Because you learned empathy from your parents, and then you extend it to others. But the foundation has to be the love that you give to your parents and the honor that you give to your parents. I think, though, frankly, I expect people will say, look, a lot of parents these days are terrible parents. So what do you say to that? And the answer I give in the chapter is, if filiality norms become conditional on whether or not your parents fulfilled your obligations, then they're over, because no parent will, there are some genuinely terrible parents, and people shouldn't have to put up with abusive parents and so forth. But if you make filiality as such conditional on whether or not individual parents upheld your own expectation or met your expectations, it's over, because everyone can have different expectations, and your expectations might shift, and you're inviting people to basically set them aside. So we'll see, but you're right that that's going to be one of the more shocking chapters, I think, for the modern reader.
The chapter I enjoyed the most was your writing about Solzhenitsyn's Harvard commencement speech of 1978. And here I did kind of get the feeling a little bit that Solzhenitsyn, coming from Russia, and people expected, he's the great dissident, he's the the great intellectual of Russia. Now he's coming to America and he's going to be on our side. And you beautifully recount how shocked and disgusted and dismayed, I mean, almost everyone was to realize, because he himself said this explicitly, that
except George Will,
right? Except for George Will, right? That no, I would not take your country, America, as it is now, as a model for reconstructing my country, Russia. And people really reacted with this is such ingratitude, but you present it as though you mostly agree with him, and I also mostly agree with him. What did you find in that Solzhenitsyn speech that grabbed you so hard?
I mean, I think there was a prophetic dimension to it. I think Solzhenitsyn, having experienced on the one hand absolute totalitarianism in the Soviet Union, a lawless communist regime, and then he comes here and he notices that the West is also disordered, but in a different way, in a more diffuse way. And that its disorders have to do with what he called legalism or liberal rights talk, where every kind of social or moral dilemma gets reduced to a contract, consent, and my rights, me. And you wage warfare against every other potential citizen and rival, as opposed to any kind of solidaristic commitment to society as a whole. And I think he really saw how that mindset, if allowed to carry on its correct trajectory then, and he was speaking in 1978, would lead to an unfree society ultimately. And I think we've gotten there. So for example, he diagnosed how the Western media, although free, he said there's liberty for the press, but not liberty for the reader, in the sense that although it's free, they serve corporate agendas, and they uphold these narrow orthodoxies or opinion corridors, so that even though, again, there's freedom of thought and speech on paper, in practice, somehow you have this kind of prevailing conformism, and then when he gave the speech, he became the target of that conformism. And I think you see that now on a much more terrifying scale playing out, because you see how maybe it was always this way, but Twitter exposes how these journalists, my professional colleagues, if you will, all of them, as though they get the memo something in the morning where how to think about a certain issue, and they all just sort of regurgitate it. How does that happen in a supposedly free society? Or how is it that, again, the private acquisitiveness and greed of private actors leads to allowing, first of all, terrible regimes, at the time the Soviet Union, to pursue its aims using the Western system. And it was the Western system, because it rejected a kind of moral foundation for what it's all for, at the time allowed the Soviet Union to have lobbyists and all sorts of apologists operating. This infuriated him. And you see that today, where China's regime and all sorts of other regimes use the freedoms of the West to ultimately undo us and threaten us. So I think I more or less I don't know where I would have been in 1978, but today I think that I see a very prescient, prophetic Jeremiah in the true sense of the word.
I've found it very, very painful to, I think along these lines, to see the unfolding debate the last few years on the political right in America, Britain, and in other countries over the question of whether there is such a thing as a common good. And you mentioned George Will. George Will was not the only conservative in the 1980s who thought that that the national interest or the common good or the public interest or some kind of a collective understanding that of what's good for us is necessary. I mean, I loved George Will's books at the time, but I think I was probably most drawn to Irving Kristol. And Irving Kristol, today people think neoconservative, that's like some kind of libertarian. But if you go back and read Irving Kristol today, read Reflections of a Neoconservative, then you'll see it's all about the common good. That's why there's only 2 cheers for capitalism, and I think if conservatives could read one essay from Irving Kristol, I think they should read his essay on pornography, which is where he says it's to him it's very straightforward. The freedom to be debased and corrupt and vicious and vile is not a right. And that's Irving Kristol. He actually goes almost as far as to say that if a regime can't police something as basic as obscenity and pornography, then it's not clear what the purpose of the government is anymore. Right? So this was a common thing to say in the 1980s. Now it's virtually disappeared, and so I've been very heartened by your taking on the common good issues and advancing them, but I've been equally disheartened to see how many friends who call themselves conservatives and see themselves as conservatives don't think that there's anything to conserve other than freedom. And it's not clear to me that's possible. That seems fantastic that you could conserve freedom and not conserve anything else.
I've tried to reflect on why that was. Why was it that in the 1980s, George Will could, in the late 1970s and 80s, George Will could stand up for Solzhenitsyn. You have Irving Kristol then having these kind of interrogations of liberalism going on among conservatives, and then it all sort of stops. And I have to say, partly it might be just a contingent historical fact that the West won the Cold War, and it stopped certain debates that were useful and very important. And we just went in this triumphalist direction. But there's such a dogmatism on these issues. Anyone who says, maybe we shouldn't have this vast kind of totally pornographized culture is an authoritarian now among many people on the right. I may find more allies among the feminist left on pornography than I would with some conservatives or many conservatives.
I think you're exactly right that the conservatives were pretty much swept aside with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so they deposed Thatcher in 1990, and from then on, conservatism becomes liberalism, and I don't think it was until that point. But what remains kind of a historical riddle that I think that we're all going to need to work on a little bit is in the 1960s there was fusionism was an alliance of liberals and conservatives against socialism and against communism, and that made sense at the time. But why is it that by the time you got to 1990, there was only liberalism left? The liberals, the liberal part of the alliance came to dominate, almost everything, and the conservatives are in fact only beginning to raise their heads again in the last few years. We don't know if it's going to be in time or if it's going to be too late, but certainly that's something that you've been way out front in leading, and part of what I think that we need to ask ourselves is here we are again, and I'll put this to you as directly as I can. The situation today is similar to the 1960s in various ways. We have a resurgent socialism at home in America. And in Britain we have a rising Chinese empire abroad. We can argue about how communist they are, but the parallels are still pretty striking. And I think it's just natural that conservatives will want to turn to anti-Marxist liberals, to anti-woke liberals, and say, look, we have to collaborate, because if we don't work together, then we may just lose everything. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, when you look at the results of that collaboration, that in the end, the liberal-conservative alliance meant that liberalism won everywhere and conservatism lost everywhere. That doesn't look like something we want to repeat again. Do you have any thoughts about what we should be doing going forward with this?
So it's something I give a great deal of thought to. Look, I know those what I would call heterodox liberals or anti-woke liberals. Many of them are my friends and are in touch with. And I try to help them, especially when they come under pressure from their own side, just because it just seems so unjust so often. But no, I have a piece in the New York Post today where it's precisely what I argue, where I'm in New York and I know lots of parents on the Upper West Side, Upper East Side who come to me and they're just terrified of woke ideology in their children's schools. And they kind of speak in hushed tones, but I'm the only kind of conservative they know, so I'm the receptacle for all their anguish. And to them, I think they would just, if they had an ideology, and most of them don't, because they're typically kind of ordinary upper middle people in Manhattan. But if they had an ideology, it would be a kind of liberal proceduralism and rights talk. And I just don't think that's enough in the face of the woke. The woke revolution, whatever it is, and we really have to come up with a name for it, by the way. I don't know if woke is the right word, but we're facing a regime and it feels like a regime. And it's not the same as communism because it often involves private corporate power. And capitalism is bound up with it. It's willing to accommodate it more often than not. But we're facing a regime. And in the face of this regime, it seems to me that liberal rights talk and proceduralism just aren't enough. That creates an asymmetry. The other side has a kind of total vision of life, something substantive. It's a twisted vision of life. It's unjust. Its claim to morality are unjust, but it is something. They really believe something. And so, to use a cliche of you need a creed to beat a creed. And so I think we need to tell the heterodox liberals, the Dave Rubins and others, whom I when they're up against kind of censorship, you defend them. But you have to tell those people, you have to come to the orbit of faith, family, nation, or something like that. That these have to be the anchors against which to promote a substantive vision over against the woke vision, not just say, hey guys, rights, come on, let's be fair in the public square. The woke just don't have any. And I think that's what we did ultimately in the Cold War. It was an alliance, like you said. I think now we need that even more. And so the way I would propose to those kind of heterodox liberals is that they need to orbit around our values if they're willing to accept the bargain, because on their own, I think they're very weak. On their own, they're very weak.
No, I think liberalism by itself is really in terrible straits right now. I find it interesting that some liberals continue to say that it's not true, but I think it's obviously true. They're not going to make it without a powerful ally, and at this point, the nationalist conservatives, the conservative conservatives, I think that's a much more likely power. Although I don't know if I want to say that I'm optimistic quite yet, for sure. Let me ask you another question about what's coming. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with the idea that religion should be integrated into the state. That there shouldn't be a separation of church and state. Now, I'm not uncomfortable with it. I actually think that the separation of church and state doesn't become an important piece of the American Constitution as a principle until the 1940s. And it doesn't really triumph until the 1960s. And so separation of church and state is, I think, something that is recent and has harmed Americans and the West generally to a very great degree. So it doesn't bother me at all that that people want to rethink that. I think it's crucial to rethink that. And in fact, in the 1980s, that was somebody like Chief Justice Rehnquist. That's what he stood for. It's time to rethink that because we made a mistake in the 1940s, and we have to go back and find a different way. But now people raise this issue about Catholic integralism, which is something that I'm only just learning about, and I know plenty of Catholics who are American nationalists and American patriots, and believe in American independence and actually think that the American Constitution was an excellent Constitution, or maybe one of the best that have ever been seen. I know lots and lots of Catholics like that. I mean, devout Catholics, Orthodox Catholics. But in terms of public influence, it definitely seems like the integralist view is picking up steam and is gaining momentum. A couple of questions. First of all, how much do you identify with it? Because people say that you identify with it, but what do you think of it? How much would you say that you are an integralist? And second, what is it about? Is it really such a terrible thing?
So I'll give you my account of it. I use the term political Catholicism. I don't use the term integralism, only because integralism has had various, 19th century, early 20th century iterations using that word that I frankly wouldn't want to be identified with, kind of dark kind of French reactionary movements and so forth. But political Catholicism is something else to my mind, and it's essentially the political vision of the Catholic Church. It's not a new invention it's not a modern thing. It's a kind of perennial teaching of the Church. And here's my formulation of it. And this is a kind of frank conversation between a faithful Catholic and a faithful Jew. So we have to see where we can suss this out. But the vision of political Catholicism, to my mind, is this: that Christianity has always been meant to be a mass religion, and therefore it fully became itself when it came to encompass Roman civilization. So that unlike a certain type of, I would argue, Anabaptist or kind of Christian libertarian vision that looks at the Constantinian conversion as this catastrophe, political Catholicism looks at the Constantinian conversion as the faith becoming more fully itself. Because then becomes first the legal religion and then the official religion of the Roman Empire. And what that means is that first of all, the Christian share of the population massively expands in a very short amount of time, from something like 5-10% to 95%. Although keeping census is hard, but roughly speaking, those are the kinds of numbers that you encounter. And so through the process of the Constantinian conversion, you had a situation in which the state was no longer making it difficult for people to be Christian. It was no longer a religion of a few kind of ascetic elites, but rather of the ordinary Roman. And he may not have been, a week earlier, he may have been offering, sacrifices to the pagan gods, and he may not have understood all the creeds, but nevertheless, he benefited from efficacious sacraments, baptism, and he lived a more humane order where you wouldn't expose babies to die outside the city walls or what have you. And that kind of perennial vision of the idea that church and civilization should be involved with each other is Christendom, is the West. Now, what form that should take in the 21st century may be different than the form that it took with, Constantine or the Emperor Theodosius or Charlemagne or what have you. The forms are different. It needn't necessarily, to my mind, be a monarchy with thrones and so forth. But we have to find some way to have kind of the religion that is at the foundation of the West to be involved with civilization, taking into account, obviously, the fact that we don't want to repeat the mistakes of medieval Christendom, right? So be very clear about that. And there are certain things that the medievals got wrong, and not being romantic about it. But to try to think, because one way or another, I think there's just no neutrality. We've learned that the past few years. Human beings like to put up their temples in the public square and their altars. So some altar will be going up, and liberal order has made the altar of the unbound self the one that it puts up in the public square. So and that's not good for people of faith. So some way or another, we have to find some way of integrating the public square and the church. But again, what form that will take, I'm open about. I've got to, we have to work that out as a kind of challenge of the 21st century. That's kind of political Catholicism to me. It's just the idea of a civilization where faith isn't so difficult. A lot of Christian liberals, and I mean libertarians as well, will just say, like, if you need the laws to support you in living a fully Christian life, then your faith isn't deep enough. That's a kind of Pelagianism, the idea that you should just strive over against all these difficult things and you achieve perfection on your own. That's a heresy. The Orthodox Christian, small Orthodox Christian vision is one in which, of course, a decent society makes it easier for people to practice the natural virtue of piety, of religiosity, and the sort of gospel seeds aren't bound to get thrown, always kind of sown among all these thorns of pornography and all these other forces that would extinguish people's faith. The faith of the ordinary person has to be somehow protected and preserved. Again, that's I think a rough summary of what I think of political Catholicism. You can call it integralism if you want.
Does any of this require rewriting the American Constitution?
It's a good question. I mean, because in some sense, it all seems so theoretical and academic as you and I speak. I think I'm persuaded by my friend Adrian Vermeule, his vision of common good constitutionalism, where he says, that the magnificent generalities of the Constitution are an invitation for us to imbue them with a kind of richer meaning of the good. And so I guess if you follow that line of thinking, the answer becomes no.
Okay. Sohrab Ahmari, thank you for joining us on NatConTalk.
Thank you.